Some people grow up in silence not because they have nothing to say, but because they know their words will never be heard. They step back not out of weakness, but to gain enough distance to see clearly who is stepping on them and who is merely pretending to offer a hand. The story you're about to hear is about a woman like that, someone who was underestimated, her entire youth excluded from family meals, and seen as a burden in need of extra guidance by the very people closest to her. But while everyone else was busy trying to dim her light, she was quietly building an entire universe. $1 million empire hidden behind a name no one paid attention to. A life rewritten without ever needing to scream for a place at the table. And when the truth was finally revealed, people weren't just shocked by what she had, they were terrified by how she got it with intelligence, calm precision, and without leaving a single unnecessary cut. This is not a story of revenge. It's proof of the simplest truth people often forget: never underestimate the quiet one. Because sometimes they're the ones writing the ending for everyone who once believed they were in control of the game. Natalie Quinn was not born to be loved, at least not in the way a child is supposed to be. In her family, love always came with conditions tied to achievements measured by someone else's standards, and rarely directed at her. Darren, Natalie's younger brother, was the center of every compliment, every family plan, every toast at holiday dinners. He had a gift for charm, the perfect all-American golden boy smile, and most importantly, he knew how to make their parents feel proud just by existing. While Darren was sent to Stanford with savings pooled from both sides of the family, Natalie had to carry the weight of her academic dreams at Georgia Tech alone, through scholarships, late-night shifts at the lab, and freelance coding jobs. Yet for an entire decade after graduation, Natalie never once brought up accomplishments others might have worn as badges of honor. She quietly built 2 biotech startups, quietly sold them, and quietly pocketed tens of millions of dollars, all under the names of intermediary companies and separate trusts. No headlines mentioned her, no family gatherings praised her. To her parents, Natalie was still the struggling sister working in research, while Darren was the polished entrepreneur with a clear future. They often suggested she learn from Darren, and even at family dinners, her mother would casually ask, "Do you want Darren to help you get into the sales department? He knows someone there." Natalie always smiled, nodded gently, and said nothing. They had no idea she held nearly 60% equity in Virexon Biolabs, the very company where she was working as a strategic advisor. They also didn't know she was the one sitting behind the boardroom meetings as the representative of TransTide Holdings, a private fund that had quietly acquired Virexon over the past 6 months. When the board appointed her as chief strategy officer, they believed they had hired a dedicated, loyal expert. No one realized they had just handed executive power to the anonymous owner of the business. And Natalie, as always, remained silent. Not because she feared being exposed, but because she wanted to see firsthand how people behaved when they believed she was the weakest person in a room they didn't know she already owned. Darren always showed up with the air of someone ready to be celebrated, even though he had never truly built anything worthy of praise. He walked into family gatherings like a self-proclaimed keynote speaker, waving to everyone, talking about deals that hadn't happened but were about to be huge, and never missed a chance to glance at his sister as if offering her a lesson in success. Natalie was different. She sat quietly at the end of the table, gently slicing her steak, while listening to her mother ask about her new research job in the same tone one might use when mentioning baking a pie. Occasionally, her mother would turn to Darren and say things like, "My son knows how to plan, how to work with people. Natalie, she's always so quiet." Natalie just smiled. They still didn't know it was her who had kept Virexon from being sold off during a market downturn. They didn't know the private meetings she'd had with financial advisors had helped pivot the company toward AI-driven biotechnology, unlocking growth opportunities Darren could never grasp with his average economics degree. On that fateful evening, as the family gathered around the table, Natalie announced she had just been appointed Chief Strategy Officer at Virexon. The first few seconds of silence were the kind that only those caught off guard by someone they'd always underestimated could create. But Darren broke the quiet with a smirk. "Oh, so you're finally getting a promotion, huh? Hope the real meetings don't overwhelm you." Her parents exchanged glances, then her mother nodded gently, her eyes filled with concern and a touch of pity. "Maybe Darren could give you some leadership tips. He's been managing teams for years." Natalie set down her wine glass, keeping her voice soft. "Your son is very capable," she said, eyes fixed on Darren. "I'll consider that offer." But deep down, she already knew this dinner wasn't the place to confront anyone. She didn't need to prove anything. The shared transfer documents locked in the safe at her home, the minutes from internal meetings, and especially the ownership structure crafted by her lawyer, were already in place for the day they thought they could outmaneuver her. Natalie didn't need to fight back. She only needed to wait. Because some truths don't need to be spoken, only revealed at the right moment. Since that evening, Darren could no longer maintain the usual facade of calm detachment whenever his sister's work was mentioned. He began showing up frequently at Virexon's headquarters, using excuses like giving partners a tour or checking in on my newly promoted sister. Employees who didn't know him would greet him with polite caution, while Darren behaved overly friendly, as if paving the way to interfere with internal affairs. Natalie observed from the glass window of her office on the 10th floor, where she could clearly see him shaking hands with the head of analytics, chatting at length with the deputy director of human resources, and occasionally strolling past the lab as if inspecting the progress. No one questioned it. With his confident demeanor, Darren gave the impression that he held some important role, someone worth staying on good terms with, unaware that his appearances were just the opening move in a carefully calculated sequence of actions. Not long after the HR department began receiving anonymous emails, vague accusations such as the CSO's capabilities are being exaggerated or her academic credentials have yet to be verified started coming in. Natalie made no public response. She recognized the tactic, the game of putting a woman under the microscope simply for succeeding without permission. She had already seen the doubt in the board's eyes when she presented the strategy to integrate AI into the biotech testing process. Not because the strategy was flawed, but because the person presenting it was a quiet woman with few connections, absent from the press, and not one of Darren's people. Then one morning, Natalie received a message from her assistant. A file was delivered to the board. Sent by express courier, no sender name on the envelope. She didn't need to guess. Inside was a thick, fabricated report printed and bound meticulously. It accused Natalie of embezzlement, falsifying her academic background, and manipulating financial reports. Emails had been cleverly altered, bank statements forged with precision. Every detail was arranged to seem legitimate, and the danger was that it arrived at exactly the right moment. Natalie understood one thing clearly: this was no longer about sibling rivalry. This was a full-blown attack, Darren's attempt to destroy her on her own turf, using the one weapon he believed she would never be strong enough to counter: doubt. But Darren had miscalculated one crucial fact: Natalie was no longer the quiet shadow at the family dinner table. She was the one holding the entire stage, and the real performance had yet to begin. Darren didn't know that while he was laying out his battlefield with forged reports, Natalie had already begun setting the stage for the final act. Not to clear her name, she didn't need to. The ones who need to prove themselves are usually those without power. But she was the one signing off on budgets, the one who had appointed the very people Darren was now whispering to. The question wasn't whether the board believed Darren, it was whether they had the courage to keep sitting in a room where they had allowed a saboteur to take a seat at the center. Natalie had sent a private message to each board member past midnight. No lengthy explanations, just a link to a shared file with a short note: "I expect everyone to be present on Friday morning." The contents of this file may seriously affect the reputation and legal responsibility of each individual in that room. On the morning of the meeting, Natalie arrived earlier than usual. She stood by the top floor window looking down at the main lobby like an audience member awaiting a play to begin. At exactly 8:45 a.m., Darren arrived. Light gray suit, polished shoes, eyes gleaming as if he were stepping into his coronation. Their parents followed behind, dressed as if attending an honorary graduation ceremony. Darren approached the reception desk with a tone that was half formal, half boastful. "The board has invited us. There's a special meeting this morning." She saw that look in his eyes, the same look he had when she was 13, and scolded by their parents for not knowing how to share her top student award with Darren. The only difference was that this time he had no idea he was about to be pulled off the stage. One by one, the board members entered the meeting room, all with serious, silent faces, each carrying a printed copy of the file she had sent. At 9:00 a.m., Natalie pushed back her chair and walked toward the room. As she entered, Marcus, the chairman of the board, was delivering a tense opening statement. "These allegations are serious. If any of them are true..." Natalie gently interrupted apologies for being late. She smiled, taking her seat at the center. "But it's hard to hold a board meeting without the person who owns the company." The room fell silent. Darren turned to her, his face going pale. "What the hell are you talking about?" He blurted out, voice trembling. Natalie signaled to her assistant to distribute documents to everyone. "Virexon Biolab ceased to be a public company 2 months ago," she said, eyes fixed on Darren. "Transtide Holdings acquired it. And I'm the sole owner of Transtide." The truth, as always, didn't need to be shouted. It only needed to be spoken at the right moment. And at that moment, Natalie had only just begun her performance. The atmosphere in the boardroom turned thick, as if someone had just dropped a glass cup, and no one dared to turn and look. Darren was frozen, his mouth slightly open but unable to produce a sound. Natalie's parents sat behind their son, their eyes shifting from shock to panic, then slowly hardening into stone, as if witnessing an entirely different world, a world in which Natalie was no longer the quiet daughter who needed help, but the one orchestrating the entire board they had always assumed Darren controlled. "Virexon has been acquired by Transtide Holdings," Natalie repeated in a calm, almost detached tone, as though stating a fact everyone should have already known. "And Transtide is a trust I established 3 years ago. All shares are under my name." Marcus, who had always maintained a neutral stance in any situation, suddenly spoke, his voice raspier than usual. "What are you trying to tell us, Natalie?" She gave a slight nod, signaling her assistant to open the tablet, and within seconds a familiar voice filled the room. Darren's voice, but this time not with the performative charm he wore in front of the board. In the recording, he was speaking with a man whose voice was deep and unfamiliar. "This girl won't last. She's only good at those useless lab tricks. Virexon needs someone who actually understands business." Another clip followed. "I've heard there's some trouble in her finance department, so if we push a few rumors, the board will definitely start to waver." Natalie let each word ring out in full, each slander, each scheme, each tone laced with malice. She didn't need to explain anything. Truth carries its own weight, and here it was pulling trust toward her without any force. When the final words faded, Natalie opened the ivory envelope in front of her and pulled out a copy of the file Darren had submitted to the board. "I received this dossier as well," she said gently. "I had everything verified, from the forged signatures, fake invoices, to the manipulated emails. Every detail left a trace, and every trace led back to one source, Darren Quinn." She paused at the perfect moment, as if allowing silence to fully settle into the room. "You tried to destroy my reputation, not just out of jealousy, but because you couldn't stand the fact that I reclaimed something you thought was your birthright recognition." Darren shot up, trying to yell something, but his voice cracked like a wave breaking into pieces. "I just wanted to protect the company from a mistake," he said, his voice trembling like a fraying thread. Natalie remained seated, her eyes fixed on him as if staring at a stranger. "You weren't protecting anyone," she replied, her voice low, but razor sharp. "You just couldn't bear the idea that someone like me would be the one who won." Under the cold white light, with an expressionless face and a spine straight as steel, Natalie wasn't just striking back. She was reclaiming the narrative and writing it anew in her own hand. No one in that room could deny that what Natalie had just presented was not merely evidence, it was a verdict against arrogance fueled by prejudice. Darren could no longer maintain the constant confidence etched into his face. He stammered through weak justifications, misunderstandings, concern for the company, a desire to make things better. But every word was like a dull blade, failing to cut anything but his own dignity. Natalie quietly placed another document on the table, a technical log showing Darren had attempted unauthorized access to the company's CRM system, searching for transactions that could be misinterpreted. Every action was traceable: date, time, IP address, even a video clip of him standing in Natalie's office during her absence using her computer under the pretense of helping check something. There was nothing left to deny, and no one left to defend him. When Marcus asked, "What action do you want the board to take?" Natalie scanned the room with absolute composure. "I want the minutes to reflect that all accusations against me were false and have been thoroughly investigated," she began. "I also want a formal letter sent to Darren's current company, including the audio recording falsified documents and evidence that he deliberately sought to damage the reputation of a senior executive, creating legal risk for Virexon." Darren staggered as if an invisible wave had just knocked him down. He whispered, almost pleading, "You're going to destroy my career." Natalie didn't nod, didn't shake her head. She simply looked straight at him and said, "You chose to do that to me first. Now you're just receiving the consequence." Then she turned to her parents. Their faces had gone pale: lips, slightly trembling eyes, hollow as if seeing their daughter for the very first time. "You said nothing when Darren submitted those defamatory files about me." Natalie said, her voice like a velvet-wrapped blade. "You didn't ask me a single question. You didn't try to find out the truth. Mother, father, you didn't come here to protect me. You came to witness me being removed as if it were inevitable." Her father spoke weakly. "We just wanted to support Darren." She cut him off, no need to raise her voice. "No. You just wanted to believe Darren was the only one worth betting on, just like always." Finally, she lifted her head and turned back to the board. "I also propose that as of today, Darren Quinn and the 2 individuals accompanying him be permanently banned from all premises, systems, and personnel of Virexon. Any contact made outside of legal channels will be considered trespassing and treated accordingly." No one objected. No one could. The silence now was no longer confusion, it was recognition. Natalie was no longer the shadow in the Quinn family. She was the only entity still standing after the truth had been revealed. 6 weeks after that fateful meeting, Natalie still arrived at the office on time. Every day still carried her unsweetened coffee and a file folder with a light gray leather cover, and still sat at the desk in her office overlooking the Portland harbor as if no storm had ever passed through. But everything had changed. There were no more subtly hostile emails from the board, no more scrutinizing glances from department heads, no more lingering doubts tied to a name once branded as unfit for leadership. Now every step she took down the hallway made others stand straighter. Every piece of feedback she offered was taken seriously, and every meeting she led commanded full attention, not because of her title, but because people now understood Natalie was the one keeping Virexon's wheels turning. And yet, just when everything seemed to have settled, Darren appeared. Not in his once confident suits or polished shoes. He stood outside her office with a crumpled brown envelope and an expression Natalie had never seen on him before: fatigue, unmasked failure, unguarded. "I won't stay long," he said as soon as he stepped in. "Just wanted to leave this." He placed the envelope on her desk, then stepped back. Not sitting, not asking for anything. Natalie didn't open it right away. She looked at him, the man once exalted by their parents, once wielding influence through charm, more than merit, now standing before her as if waiting for a sentence to be handed down. "That contains everything I collected while trying to bring you down," Darren said quietly. "Passwords, fake email accounts, edited documents, even proof that I worked with a former employee to fabricate those false reports. I've sent copies to the board and to my former company. I'm not making excuses anymore." Natalie still said nothing. Inside her, there was no more anger, no urge to punish. Only clarity remained. Darren had finally understood it was never about power. It was about consequences. Before leaving, Darren turned back, his eyes red not from tears but from the weight of realizing something he had gone far too long without seeing. "You succeeded. Not because of anyone, but despite everything. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I just want to start over at a small startup, not as a boss. No shortcuts. If one day I really change, would you read my resume?" Natalie didn't respond immediately, but as he turned to leave, she called out softly, "Send it to me in a year. Not for a leadership position. For an internship. If you're truly serious." Darren nodded for the first time, no longer the Darren everyone had known, but a man beginning again at a price he alone had chosen to pay. And Natalie, once cast out from her own family's dinner table, now opened a door, not out of blood ties, but from the strength of no longer needing hatred to feel whole. 6 months had passed since Darren walked out of Natalie's office with reddened eyes and a promise yet to be fulfilled. Virexon Biolabs was no longer the name mentioned second, it was the name uttered first at every biotech conference along the West Coast. Under Natalie's quiet but resolute leadership, the company not only recovered from its internal turmoil, but expanded into 3 new states, secured 2 exclusive agreements with leading research institutes, and most notably, brought a data-driven enzyme-based early diagnostic application into clinical trials. She never appeared on magazine covers or gave speeches at grand press events, but her name was the one investors whispered about after every closed-door meeting. They called her the ghost visionary, the architect in the shadows. Natalie maintained her habit of walking home before night, fully fell a short route from the office to her apartment by the park, where she could watch the sunset slip past the red brick rooftops and rows of maples turning with the seasons. On some evenings, she sat by the window, warm tea in hand, her phone lighting up with a message from her mother, usually awkward check-ins or something like, "Your father mentioned you at dinner tonight. Someone at his company just found out you're the CEO of Virexon. They were very impressed." No apologies, no acknowledgments, just small circles drawn in the air, attempts to inch closer without admitting they once pushed her away. Natalie didn't reply right away. She had learned to see these messages like wind brushing the surface of a lake, rippling, stirring, but no longer capable of sinking anything. Sometimes during tense board meetings, Natalie still recalled the moment she stood in that conference room, pointed at Darren and said, "The difference between us is that when I thought you were failing, I stayed silent so you wouldn't feel small. But when you thought I was failing, you did everything to make sure I couldn't get back up." That line wasn't just an accusation, it was a mirror, held up to a quiet life, one where she had learned that her worth was never tied to someone else's recognition. Then, on a Monday morning, while reviewing emails before a strategic meeting, she saw a message from a familiar address, Darren.Quinn. Resume say. The content was brief, without embellishment. "I did exactly what you told me. Attached is my resume, not asking for favors, just asking to start over." Natalie didn't open the file immediately. She sat still for a moment, hand resting on the mouse eyes on the subject line. Not because she hesitated, but because she understood forgiveness doesn't always mean erasing the past. Sometimes it means giving someone the chance to prove they're no longer who they once were. And she now was strong enough to do that, not out of obligation, but because her trust was no longer tethered to pain. The corner room on the 21st floor, where the afternoon light streamed through the large glass window, casting a pale, golden hue over the thick ash-gray carpet, had become the place where Natalie sat at the end of each day. From here, she could see the Portland skyline where the sun set behind the Cascade Range, like a smudge of crimson brushed across the edge of the world. There were no longer expectations to meet, no lingering need to prove anything to anyone, only a deep sense of stillness, as if she had finally stepped out of the role others once wrote for her and become the director of her own stage. Her inbox was now filled with partnership requests, pending federal projects awaiting signature, and invitations from universities asking her to join as a strategic advisor. But what made Natalie smile wasn't any of those accolades. It was a simple card printed with a quiet blue sky tucked among the glossy congratulatory envelopes, a card from Darren sent with no expectations, no demands for a response. Inside, in handwriting still slightly slanted like back in high school, it read, "You didn't succeed because of us. You succeeded in spite of us. I'm learning to do the same." There was no apology. There didn't need to be. Just a quiet acknowledgement, profound in its restraint, that he understood now that true strength lies not in applause, but in the ability to stand firm when the world turns away. Natalie placed the card in a drawer not to hide it, but in the same way she kept important documents as a reminder that even storms can become a source of light if you know where to stand. Occasionally, her mother still sent messages, a photo of dinner with a caption saying, "Wish you were at the table," or a note that someone at a conference had recognized her as the mother of CEO Natalie Quinn. These messages no longer hurt. They were simply the old chapter trying to reopen itself from the side of those who once closed it too quickly. Natalie replied politely, never cold, but never allowing hope to stretch beyond the bounds she had learned to keep. She had come to understand that some wounds don't need healing, only the space to rest and the strength to live wholly around them. Outside the window, the city lights began to flicker on. Natalie remained seated, the tea on her desk, cooling, a pending expansion plan open in front of her. Yet her eyes followed the quiet stream of cars below, as if listening to the rhythm of a city she once believed would never welcome her. Now everything was clear. The recognition she once yearned for didn't come from her family, nor from the crowd. It came from the way she held herself steady in silence, patiently building without needing to prove. And that was the greatest victory, not one that needed cheering, but one that simply was. Some victories don't need to be announced, they just need to exist. And some people don't need others to believe in their worth, because they've already built it silently through every slight, every unspoken wound, every time they swallowed what should have been defended. Natalie didn't reclaim fairness by shouting, she did it through outcomes. She didn't tear anyone down. She simply stood up. And that was enough for the false to expose themselves. If you've ever been underestimated by family, by society, remember, this success doesn't require permission. You just have to keep building, even in the dark. And one day the light will have no choice but to come looking for you. Leave a comment if this story resonated with you. What would you do in Natalie's place? Stay silent, fight back, or quietly flip the entire script? Don't forget to like, share this video, so others can hear this message, and subscribe to the channel for more stories. Stories that might be yours or mine or anyone else's who was once seen as insignificant, because sometimes the one most underestimated is the only one who never needed anyone's permission to win.